Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into Shakespeare. We're working with the complete works, and we're going to focus on Henry VI, Part 2. I think it's safe to say we all know the name Shakespeare, but what's the big deal? What makes him so important? And what about this specific play?
Well, Shakespeare isn't just famous. He's considered foundational to English literature and drama. And when it comes to Henry VI, Part 2, it's thought to be his first play, which is kind of fascinating. Gives us a unique look at his development as a writer.
Right, like seeing the rough drafts before the masterpieces. And just looking at the table of contents here is incredible. You've got comedies like The Comedy of Errors, tragedies like Hamlet. It's like a whole history of theater right here. But
Mm.
today, it's all about Henry VI, Part 2. It's a history play set during the reign of King Henry VI. A pretty turbulent time, as I understand it. And the source material here mentions the death of the king's advisor and the rise of the Duke of York, which, well, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It certainly is. We're talking about the Wars of the Roses here, a real, no-holds-barred conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster. Imagine a real-life Game of Thrones with all the power struggles and backstabbing you can imagine. And that's the backdrop for Henry VI, Part 2.
Wow, okay. So to get this play, we need to get the Wars of the Roses. Can you give us some context?
Of course, the Wars of the Roses were a series of civil wars that ripped England apart in the 15th century. We're talking two powerful families, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose, and the House of York, with their white rose. Both of them wanted the throne and were willing to fight for it. The country was torn apart by their rivalry.
So this isn't just Shakespeare making things up. This is based on real history, real people, real consequences.
Absolutely. And Shakespeare uses this historical backdrop to explore some really universal themes, things like power, ambition, loyalty, fate, things that we can still relate to even today, centuries later.
And of course, we can't forget the language. I mean, you've spent years studying Shakespeare. Is it the language that makes him so enduring?
Well, that's definitely part of it. Shakespeare, I mean, he invented so many phrases we still use today, but it's more than just fancy words. It's his ability to get to the heart of human emotion, love, despair, everything in between. And he does it with such depth and complexity. And then he wraps it all up in this wit and poetry that's just, well, it's unmatched.
And you've picked out a few lines from Henry VI, Part 2, that really stood out to you. Could you share those with us?
Definitely. In Act 1, Scene 2, the Duchess of Gloucester talks about a dream she had. Pretty creepy one, actually. She says, "Methought this staff, mine office badge in court, was broke in twain, by whom I have forgot, but as I think, it was by the cardinal." Now, on the surface, it's just a dream, right? But it really sets the tone for the entire play, this feeling of dread, this underlying fear of betrayal. It's like a shadow hanging over everything.
Dreams in Shakespeare. Never just dreams, are they? Always a deeper meaning. Always some foreshadowing going on.
Right. Shakespeare uses this dream, the Duchess's dream, to introduce the idea of superstition, the supernatural. And that paves the way for some darker elements that come up later in the play.
Speaking of darker elements, it looks like we've got witchcraft in this play, too. The source material mentions a character, Bolingbroke, who conjures spirits. So is Shakespeare just using the supernatural as a plot device here, or is there something more going on?
Oh, it's definitely more than just a plot device. Think about it. This was a time when people really believed in witches and magic. So by putting these things in his play, Shakespeare's giving us a glimpse into how people thought back then, both the characters and the audience.
So he's weaving in all these different layers. It's historical, it's political, it's psychological, and now it's supernatural.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes Shakespeare, well, Shakespeare. He's not afraid to explore the complexities of what it means to be human on all those different levels.
One character that really jumps out from the description is Jack Cade, described as a commoner who leads a rebellion. Why is he so important to the story?
Well, Jack Cade gives a voice to the common people, the ones who usually get left out of the history books. He's a powerful symbol of social unrest, of what can happen when those in power ignore the needs of the people.
And let's be honest, their anger is understandable. They're struggling to survive while the nobility is busy fighting over the throne.
Absolutely. Shakespeare lets Cade speak his mind. He gives him these really powerful speeches where he lays out the grievances of the common people. He rails against the corrupt legal system, promises to create a society where everyone is equal.
So it sounds like Cade is a more complex character than just a straight-up villain.
He is. Shakespeare doesn't portray him as a saint, but he also doesn't dismiss his concerns. He makes us think about why rebellions happen, about the desperation that can drive people to violence.
There's a line from the source material that really captures this. Cade says, "Henceforward all things shall be in common, and in Cheapside shall my palfrey go to grass." That's a pretty bold statement. He's promising radical change.
Absolutely, and that's Cade's appeal. He's promising to turn everything upside down, to create a world where the common people have a voice. Of course, things don't always go as planned, especially when it comes to revolutions.
And Shakespeare isn't afraid to show that, is he? He shows us the violence, the chaos that comes with Cade's rebellion.
Right. He shows the brutality on both sides, reminding us that even when people are fighting for what they believe in, things can easily spin out of control.
So he's got the Duke of York plotting his rise to power, Jack Cade leading a rebellion. It feels like the kingdom is coming apart at the seams. Where does King Henry fit into all of this?
Well, poor Henry is stuck trying to hold everything together. But he's becoming more and more isolated, more and more powerless. Shakespeare shows us this real struggle within Henry, trying to reconcile his religious beliefs with the harsh realities of politics.
And there's that scene in Act Two where he's presented with the head of his advisor, Duke Humphrey, murdered by the Duke of York's allies. That's a brutal scene.
It really is. And it shows us Henry's good heart, but it also shows that he's not equipped to protect the people who are loyal to him.
We were talking earlier about the Duke of York and how he's a master manipulator. How does he use this situation, this tragedy, to his advantage?
Oh, he's clever. He acts outraged by Gloucester's death, which of course further weakens Henry's authority, creates even more distrust among the nobles. It's like he's turning tragedy into opportunity.
He's always a few steps ahead, isn't he? Like he's playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers.
That's a great way to put it. The Duke of York is always thinking ahead, always anticipating his opponent's next move, and of course always ready to exploit their weaknesses.
While we're on the subject of the Duke of York, the source material mentions his sons, Edward and Richard. What part do they play in Act Two?
Well, Act Two is where we meet them. Edward and Richard, I mean. And we can already see them starting to follow in their father's footsteps. Edward, he's ambitious and eager to prove himself. And Richard, though he's younger, you can see the cunning, the ruthlessness even then. It's almost a foreshadowing of his future as Richard III.
Ah, Richard III, Shakespeare's most infamous villain. It's fascinating to see the early stages of that character.
It is. It shows how Shakespeare weaves these interconnected stories, creating this amazing tapestry of history and drama.
Okay, so to sum things up, by the end of Act Two, we've got a king who's losing control, a scheming duke on the rise, a rebellion in full swing, and two very ambitious sons waiting in the wings. Doesn't sound like things are going to calm down anytime soon.
No, not at all. Act 3 is where all these conflicts, all these tensions, they finally explode. It's time for war.
Before we get to the battlefield of Act 3, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about how Shakespeare uses symbolism. We've talked about the significance of dreams and prophecies, but what other symbols stand out to you?
Well, right off the bat, you've got the red and white roses, the symbols of the houses of Lancaster and York. But they represent more than just families, They're like opposing forces, love and hate, order and chaos, tradition versus rebellion.
And those symbols are everywhere in the play, right? From the dialogue to the costumes, even the way the stage is set up.
Exactly. Shakespeare was a master of using symbols to add layers of meaning, to really drive home the play's main themes. Think about the Duchess of Gloucester's public humiliation, where she has to wear that paper crown. It's a powerful image of how fragile power is, how quickly fortune can change.
And what about Jack Cade and his rebellion? Any symbolism tied to that storyline?
Well, when you think of Cade's rebellion, you think of fire, of chaos. He talks about burning London to the ground, overthrowing everything. His followers are called a rabble, a mob. It's all about a lack of control.
It's amazing how Shakespeare can create such vivid images in our minds just with his words. You can practically see the flames and hear the crowds shouting.
That's the magic of Shakespeare's language. It's so evocative, so powerful. He takes us right back to that time and place.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We've dug into the Duke of York's schemes, explored why Jack Cade led a rebellion, and watched King Henry's authority crumble. We've even touched on Shakespeare's use of symbolism and how he creates these complex characters that feel real. Are you ready to jump into Act 3?
Let's do it. The stakes are higher than ever. The battle for the throne is about to begin.
Okay, we're back, and we're diving deeper into Henry VI, Part 2. Last time, we left off with the Duchess of Gloucester's very public humiliation, and things weren't looking so good for King Henry. What's next in Act Two?
Well, things get even more complicated in Act Two. All the political maneuvering really starts to heat up. Remember, the Duke of York wants the throne, and he's not afraid to play dirty to get it.
And King Henry, well, he's still trying to keep the peace, but in this play, it doesn't seem like that's going to work out so well for him.
It doesn't. Shakespeare portrays Henry as a very religious man, more focused on, on his soul than on earthly power. But that makes him a weak king, especially in this world of, ambition and ruthlessness.
So while Henry is praying for peace, the Duke York is busy scheming. What kind of tactics does he use? How does he go about trying to get that throne?
Well, Shakespeare really shows us how the Duke of York is manipulating everyone around him. Like, he pretends to be loyal to Henry, but secretly he's turning the nobility against him, spreading rumors, propaganda, anything to make himself look better and his rivals look worse.
It's interesting, right? Shakespeare presents all this scheming and power grabbing, not as big battles or anything, but as these like whispered conversations in the halls of power.
Exactly. He understood that real power, well, it's often about persuasion, about manipulation, not brute brute force.
Okay, so the Duke of York is playing the long game. But what about the common people? What about Jack Cade and that rebellion we were talking about? What happens with them in Act Two?
Well, Cade's rebellion, it really picks up steam in Act Two. He gets more and more followers, people who are tired of the corruption, the inequality.
And they have every right to be angry. I mean, they're struggling to survive while the nobility is, fighting amongst themselves.
Exactly. And Shakespeare gives Cade some incredible speeches.
Yeah.
He really lets him articulate the people's grievances, He talks about reforming the legal system, creating a society where everyone's equal.
So maybe he's not just a villain then.
Right. He's complex. Shakespeare doesn't portray him as some kind of hero, but he also makes us consider his point of view, understand why people might be driven to rebellion.
The source material has one of his lines. Cade says, "Henceforward all things shall be in common, and in Cheapside shall my palfrey go to grass." He's promising some serious changes.
He is. He wants to upend the entire system, create a world where the common people have a say. Of course, revolutions rarely go smoothly, do they?
And Shakespeare definitely doesn't shy away from showing that. He shows us just how violent, how chaotic things get when Cade's rebellion reaches its peak.
He does.
Yeah.
And he shows the brutality on both sides, reminding us that, that revolutions can have some pretty devastating consequences, even when they're fighting for a good cause.
Okay, so we've got the Duke of York scheming, we've got Jack Cade leading this rebellion. It seems like everything is falling apart. What's King Henry doing during all of this?
Poor Henry. He's still trying to hold it all together, but it's clear he's losing his grip. He's becoming more and more isolated, more and more powerless. And Shakespeare really shows how Henry is struggling with his beliefs, his faith, versus the realities of politics.
Right. And there's that awful scene where he's shown the head of his advisor, Duke Humphrey, murdered, of course, by the Duke of York's allies. It's heartbreaking.
It really is. It shows Henry's inherent goodness, but also just how incapable he is of protecting those who are loyal to him.
You mentioned earlier how manipulative the Duke of York is. How does he use this horrible event to his advantage?
Oh, he's a pro at this. He pretends to be outraged by Gloucester's death, knowing full well that it'll weaken Henry even more. So even more distrust. He knows how to turn a tragedy into an opportunity.
Like we were saying before, it's like he's always playing chess, always thinking several steps ahead.
Exactly. He's always thinking ahead, anticipating his enemy's moves. And he's always ready to use their weaknesses against them.
The source material also mentions the Duke of York's sons, Edward and Richard. What role do they play in Act Two?
Well, Act Two is where we first meet them. Edward and Richard, that is. And it's clear they're following in their father's footsteps. Edward's ambitious, wants to prove himself. And Richard, although he's younger, you can see the cunning there, the ruthlessness. Like Shakespeare is giving us a glimpse of what he'll become, Richard III.
Richard III, Shakespeare's ultimate villain. It's amazing to see those seeds planted here.
It is. It shows Shakespeare's skill at weaving all these different stories together, creating this whole world of history and drama.
So at the end of Act Two, we have a king who's barely hanging on, a duke who's making his play for the throne, a rebellion that's raging, and two very ambitious brothers waiting in the wings. It doesn't sound like things are going to get any calmer in Act Three.
Not at all. Act Three is where it all comes to a head. The battle lines are drawn. It's time for war.
All right. Before we get into all that fighting, let's talk about symbolism. We've discussed the significance of dreams and prophecies, but what other symbols really stand out in this play?
Well, the red and white roses are the most obvious ones, right? The symbols of Lancaster and York. But they represent so much more than just families. They're like opposing forces,
Mhm.
love and hate, order and chaos, tradition versus rebellion.
And those symbols are woven throughout the entire play, right? In the dialogue, the costumes, even in the stage design itself.
Exactly. Shakespeare used symbols to add these layers of meaning, to really emphasize the play's main themes. Think about when the Duchess of Gloucester is publicly humiliated and she's made to wear a paper crown. That's such a strong image. It shows how fragile power really is, how fickle fate can be.
And what about Jack Cade's rebellion? Are there any specific symbols connected to that?
Well, Cade's rebellion, it's all about fire and chaos. He wants to burn London down, overturn the established order, and his followers are called a rabble, a mob. There's a sense of things spiraling out of control.
It's incredible how Shakespeare can create these such vivid images using just his words. You can almost feel the heat from the flames, hear the roar of the crowd.
That's the power of Shakespeare's language. It's evocative, it's visceral. He transports us right back to that time and place.
Okay, so we've talked about the Duke of York's plotting, the motivations behind Jack Cade's rebellion, and we've watched as Henry's authority crumbled. We've even delved into Shakespeare's brilliant use of symbolism and his talent for creating these amazingly complex, nuanced characters. Are you ready to see what happens next? Are you ready for Act 3?
Absolutely. The stakes are higher than ever now. The fight for the English throne is about to begin.
All right, we're back, and things are about to get real in Henry VI, Part 2. Last we left off, well, the kingdom was on the verge of war. The Duke of York was making his move, Jack Cade's rebellion was in full swing, and poor King Henry, he just couldn't seem to catch a break.
Act 3. It's a wild ride. It's where all those simmering conflicts finally boil over. The battle lines are drawn. The fight for the throne, it begins in earnest.
So let's talk about the Duke of York. He's been pulling strings behind the scenes for so long, but in Act 3, he finally comes out in the open and challenges King Henry directly.
Exactly. He gathers his allies, raises an army, and declares that he is the rightful heir. He uses all the chaos from Cade's rebellion to his advantage, saying, look, Henry is weak. He can't rule.
Smart move. And what about Cade's rebellion? Does it just fade away, or does it play a part in this larger conflict?
Unfortunately for Cade, his rebellion is crushed.
Yeah.
Brutally. Shakespeare shows us how those in power can manipulate and crush popular uprisings.
It's a reminder that even when people are fighting for what they believe in, things can go very wrong very quickly.
Definitely. And Shakespeare doesn't sugarcoat it. He shows the real cost of this conflict.
Yeah.
Innocent people caught in the crossfire, families torn apart, a whole society collapsing into anarchy.
It's interesting how Shakespeare uses Cade's rebellion to explore the dangers of mob mentality and how seductive power can be.
Oh, absolutely. Cade starts out with noble goals, but as he gains power, he becomes a tyrant. Paranoid, cruel. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition takes over.
So Cade's rebellion is over. The Duke of York is openly challenging the king. What's happening with Henry through all of this?
Henry. He's in a tough spot. She's a peaceful man forced into war. He tries to reason with York, to negotiate. But York, he's not interested.
That's got to be frustrating for Henry. Trying to do the right thing, but constantly being undermined by those who are more ruthless, more ambitious.
It is. Shakespeare paints him as a tragic figure. A good man who's just not cut out for this world of politics and violence.
The source material mentions a scene where the Duke of York confronts Henry and forces him to acknowledge York's claim to the throne. Can you tell us more about that?
That scene is crucial. It's where York lays it all out. His genealogy, his claim to the throne. He uses legal arguments, historical precedents, everything he can to justify his rebellion.
Wow, I bet that's a tense scene.
It is. And it shows how powerful language can be, how history can be twisted to serve someone's agenda.
So by the end of Act 3, the sides are chosen. It's York and his supporters against Henry and his dwindling band of loyalists. What happens in Act 4?
Act 4 is where the war really begins. Shakespeare doesn't hold back. The battles are brutal, the imagery is vivid, the stakes are incredibly high. We see the horror of combat, the strategies, the devastating consequences for everyone involved.
And what about our main players in all of this? The Duke of York, King Henry, Edward, and Richard. Do any of them come out of this unscathed?
Well, in a classic Shakespearean twist, the Duke of York is killed in battle. His ambition, his plotting, it all comes to an end. He never gets to see his plans come to fruition. It's his sons who are left to continue the fight.
So even the mastermind doesn't get what he wants. Another reminder that fate is unpredictable and, well, ambition can be a dangerous game.
It is. Shakespeare seems to be saying that even the most cunning, the most ambitious, can be brought down by forces outside their control.
With the Duke of York gone, who takes over the Yorkist cause.
His eldest son, Edward, steps up.
Hmm.
He wants revenge for his father's death, and he's determined to claim the throne. He's charismatic, he's ambitious, but he can also be reckless, which that comes back to bite him later on.
And what about Richard? The source material suggests he plays a pretty important role in Act 4.
He does. Richard, even though he's younger, he proves to be a brilliant strategist and a fierce warrior. He's motivated by loyalty to his family and a desire for revenge. And you can see glimpses of that ruthlessness, that cunning that will make him so infamous as Richard III.
It's fascinating to see how Shakespeare lays the groundwork for these characters, showing us their strengths, their weaknesses, their ambitions, their vulnerabilities.
He does. And he makes us question our own ideas about good and evil, right and wrong. These characters, they're not simple. They're driven by a mix of motivations.
Okay, so at the end of Act 4, we have a New Yorkist leader, a king struggling to keep his crown, and two ambitious brothers who are both vying for power. What happens in the final act?
Act 5. It's the climax of the whole play. Battles, betrayals, alliances shifting constantly. The Yorkists and the Lancastrians are fighting tooth and nail for England.
And who wins? Does Henry manage to keep his throne, or does Edward take it from him?
After a lot of bloodshed, a lot of fighting, Edward and the Yorkists are victorious. Henry is deposed, imprisoned, and Edward becomes King Edward I.
So the Duke of York's ambition, his dream, it's realized even if it's through his son. What about Henry? Does he meet a tragic end?
Shakespeare doesn't kill him off, but Henry is broken. He's lost his power, his dignity. He becomes a pawn in this game of power, a symbol of how fleeting glory can be.
It's a victory for the Yorkists, but a bittersweet one. They have the throne, but the country's in ruins. And the cycle of violence, it doesn't seem like it's ending anytime soon.
Exactly. Shakespeare doesn't give us easy answers, a happily ever after. He leaves us with this sense of unease. The battle for power, it never really ends.
And Richard, where does he fit into all of this? Is he content with his brother's victory, or does he have his own plans?
Shakespeare gives us a hint of what's to come for Richard. That ambition, it's still there. We know that eventually he'll seize the throne for himself, becoming the tyrannical Richard III.
It's incredible how much Shakespeare packs into this one play. History, drama, psychological insights. No wonder his work still resonates with us today.
He was a genius, there's no doubt about it. He understood human nature, the pull of power, the dangers of ambition, the fight for justice. Those are themes that are always relevant.
Well said. Shakespeare's plays, they're not just stories from the past. They hold up a mirror to us, to our own hopes, our fears, our desires. Maybe by understanding these characters, their choices, we can learn something about ourselves, about the world we live in.
That's a great point. Shakespeare's work is full of insights, and I encourage everyone to keep exploring his plays, whether you read them, watch them, or, well, discuss them like we're doing now.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Henry VI, Part 2. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope you'll join us again as we explore more of the world's greatest stories.